Hello, welcome to Microfiche Microphone. I'm Micah, and in this channel we look at microfiche of old newspapers and compare them to today. So these are old historical newspaper articles that are all in the public domain. None of them are under copyright anymore, so I am able to read the entire article. So today, our microfiche time capsule is from the London Magazine from 1768 in January, and the article is entitled Historical Account of the Troubles in America. Now this article is in a British magazine, and there are some differences to the way we use our letters today. So there is the letter S that looks very much like an F. Please be aware of that. It comes up several times. It can make it a little confusing as you're reading it yourself. The waves never rife, but when the winds blow. Yeah, no, that's actually not true. You ever heard of a tsunami caused by earthquakes? They could be very, very quiet then. Anyway, that's interesting. All right. Sir, as the cause of the present ill humor in America, and of the resolutions taken there to purchase less of our manufactures does not seem to be generally understood, it may afford some satisfaction to your readers if you give them the following short historical state of facts. I think that's fair. So what this is talking about is it's talking about the tariffs that the American colonies applied on British goods. I think that evidently the person who wrote the article felt that most people did not understand why that was happening, and they want to explain it. So I appreciate this. Thank you, writer. From the time that the colonies were first considered as capable of granting aid to the crown down to the end of the last war, it is said that the constant mode of obtaining those aids by the requisition made from the crown through its governors to the several assemblies, in circular letters from the Secretary of State in His Majesty's name, setting forth the occasion, requiring them to take the matter into consideration, and expressing a reliance on their prudence, duty, and affection to His Majesty's government, that they would grant such sums, or raise such numbers of men, as were suitable to their respective circumstances. Okay, that is very long-winded, and it basically says that they owe loyalty to the king. Okay, the colonies, being accustomed to this method, have from time to time granted money to the crown, or raised troops for its service in proportion to their abilities. And during all of the last war, beyond their abilities, so that considerable sums were returned them yearly by Parliament, as they had exceeded their proportion. Okay, so they're saying that they used the money and raised troops, and some of the Americans even volunteered to assist the troops. So they provided them also with people. Okay, that's good. Had this happy method of requisition been continued, there is no doubt that all of the money that could reasonably be expected to be raised from them in any manner might have been obtained without the least offense. Once again, this writer is on the side of the Americans. They're like, dude, if you hadn't changed the rules, they probably wouldn't have had a problem. So that's interesting that even the British writers were on the side of the Americans at the time. They're like, yeah, we know we're kind of screwing you over, but, you know, whatever. It was well known that the colonists universally were of opinion that no money could be levied from English subjects but by their own consent given by themselves or their chosen representatives, and that if any man or body of men in which they had no representative of their choosing could tax them at pleasure, they could not be said to have any property, anything they could call their own. That's a good point. So if there's somebody saying, hey, we're just going to tax you however we flip and feel like it, and you have no say, then they don't even feel like that their houses are theirs, because they feel like they can be taken away at any moment from this strange, like, very detached sovereign. I do not undertake here to support these opinions of the Americans. They have been refuted by the late Act of Parliament declaring its own power, which very Parliament, however, shewed wisely, which very Parliament, however, shewed wisely so much tender regard to those inveterate prejudices as to repeal a tax that had militated against them, And those prejudices are still so fixed and rooted in the Americans that it has been supposed not a single man among them has been convinced of his error, even by that act of Parliament. Yeah. So they have repealed the tax, apparently, that they had against the Americans. And on the Americans, I guess the taxes aren't against you, it's for you, in theory. Anyway, but that the Americans are very prejudiced against the acts of Parliament since they have no say in them at all. Okay, yeah, I can see that. The person then who first projected to lay aside the accustomed method of requisition and to raise money on America by stamps seems not to have acted wisely in deviating from that method which the colonists looked upon as constitutional. Okay, I would like to say here, I did look this up, the American Constitution had not yet been written. There was an American colony constitution which was written in something ridiculous like 1640. It was a long time ago. Even at this point, it was a long time ago, and they personally did not have any say in that constitution either. So, but they were more okay with that constitution since it was created by the Americans for the Americans than they were on the British Constitution. So they didn't care as much about the British Constitution, whether or not it was in alignment with that. But they were working on their American Constitution, the American Colonies Constitution. Okay, so let's restart that sentence. Okay, the person then who first projected to lay aside the accustomed method of the requisition and to raise money on America by stamps seems not to have acted wisely in deviation from that method which the colonists looked upon as constitutional and thwarting unnecessarily the fixed prejudices of so great a number of the king's subjects. You got a point. Yeah, like... It was not, however, for want of knowledge that what he was about to do would give them great offense. He appears to have been very sensible of this, and apprehensive that it might occasion some disorders, to prevent or suppress which, he presented another bill, which was brought on the same session with the Stamp Act, whereby it was made lawful for military officers in the colonies to quarter their soldiers in private houses. Oh, geez. Okay, so at the time that they switched the way they were paying people with stamps instead of with regular money. And they also allowed military officers to quarter in their soldiers in private houses. Okay, that means that anybody could show up at your door, and if you had a spare bed, they could say, okay, our officer is going to sleep here now. Like, geez, I have a spare bed at home. It's in my 5-year-old's room. Like... I'm kind of not okay with this, like random strangers sleeping there. Go away. Ugh, that's awful. I would hate that, and I think that anybody in their right mind would hate that. This seemed intended to awe the people into compliance with the other act. Okay, so he thinks that this idea of having soldiers living in people's houses is going to make them or force them to accept the Stamp Act, where they're not being paid properly for their, as they had been. They're not being paid as they had been for what they were doing. Great opposition, however, being raised here against the bill by the agents from the colonies and the merchants trading thither, the colonists declaring that under such a power in the army, no one could look on this house as his own, or think he had a home, where soldiers might be thrust up into it and mixed with his family at the pleasure of an officer. Absolutely. That part of the bill was dropped. But there still remained a clause when it passed into a law to oblige the several assemblies to provide quarters for the soldiers, furnishing them with firing. That is what that means, right? Okay, yeah, I think that like fire, like because they need fire to cook and whatever. Okay, with firing, bedding, candles, small beer or rum, and sundry other articles at the expense of the several provinces. Okay, so they changed it. So they said, okay, we're not going to put the soldiers inside your houses. However, you do have to provide things for them so that they can live. All right, that's relatively reasonable, I guess, in a sense, because I personally expect the government to pay the soldiers, but at the same time, the government has to get money from somewhere. So I guess if they're saying that we're going to use the money you give us to give to them, but that doesn't really sound like what's happening here. It sounds like they're expecting donations. I wouldn't want to be a soldier back then. Jeez, you weren't very well supported. It's like, okay, we're going to go chill here, and we're going to hang out in this area, and we're expecting the people who live here to give us food and candles and bedding. Okay, that's interesting. Jeez. Okay. And this act continued in force when the Stamp Act was repealed. Though if obligatory on the assemblies, it equally mitigated against the American principle above mentioned that money is not to be raised on English subjects without their consent. So the writer here is saying that they are upset about this because you're not allowed to just have to give something without agreeing to it first, and that is one of the pieces of the British Constitution that they were not following themselves. Ugh. Just because they're in the colonies, they're not subject to this rule, I guess. The colonies, nevertheless, being put into high good humor by the repeal of the Stamp Act, chose to avoid the fresh dispute upon the other, it being temporary and soon to expire, never as they hoped to revive again. And in the meantime they, by various ways in different colonies, provided for the quartering of the troops, either by acts of their own assemblies, without taking notice of the... Okay, here it's like redacted, but I think it means Act of Parliament. Yeah? I'm not sure, though. If you have another idea, write it down below, but I think that's what it means. Without taking notice of the Act of Parliament, or by some variety of small diminution, as of salt and vinegar, in the supplies required by the Act, that what they did might appear a voluntary act of their own, and not done in obedience to the Act of Parliament, which, according to their ideas of their rights, they thought hard to obey. So, he's saying they hated the Stamp Act and they got it repealed. But that the act to support the troops, they actually did do. So, you have to be appreciative of what they actually did. Now, some of these redacted things, I have no idea what they're trying to say. So if you have an idea, please write it below. I have a couple here that I'm not sure about, so. It might have been well if the matter had thus passed without notice, but something starting with a G and ending in an R, having written home an angry and aggravating letter upon this conduct in the assembly of his province, the outed, starting with a P and ending in R, whatever that means, of the Stamp Act and his adherents, then in opposition, raised such a clamor against America as being in rebellion, and against those who had been for the repeal of the Stamp Act as having thereby been encouragers of this supposed rebellion, that it was thought necessary to enforce the quartering by another act of Parliament, taking away from the province of New York, which had been the most explicit in its refusal, all the powers of legislation till it should have complied with that act, the news of which greatly alarmed the people everywhere in America, as it has been said, the language of such an act seemed to them to be, obey implicitly the laws made by the Parliament of Great Britain to raise money on you without your consent, and you shall enjoy no right or privileges at all. Yeah, pretty much. So basically, the British government thought that the Americans were in rebellion because they didn't like the Stamp Act and that they were refusing to quarter the soldiers inside their houses. However, the Americans felt like they were being unreasonable because they still had no say in any of these rules. And so what they're trying to feel like what Parliament is saying to them is obey the rules whether or not you like it, and you're not even allowed to say anything about it. So deal. And that's how they felt. They even felt like their houses were not their own. They said that specifically. So, at the same time, a person lately in high office projected the levying more money from America by new duties on various articles of our own manufacture. Yeah, so they're going to add some more taxes to things that they make from England and then ship to America, as glass, paper, painters' colors, etc., appointing a new board of customs and sending over a set of commissioners with large salaries to be established at Boston, who were to have the care of collecting those duties, which were by the Act expressly mentioned to be intended for the payment of the salaries of governors, judges, and other officers of the Crown in America. And it being a pretty general opinion here that those officers ought not to depend on the people there for any part of their support. Okay, so they're saying that the taxes that they put on glass, paper, and paint, whatever, was such that they were used to pay the judges and the governors that were in America, and so that the people didn't have to support them. And they're like, oh, look what nice people we are. Okay, the colonists, being thus greatly alarmed, began seriously to consider their situation and to resolve afresh in their minds of grievances, which from their respect and love for this country they had long borne and seemed almost willing to forget. They reflected how lightly the interest of all America had been estimated here, when the interest of a few inhabitants of Great Britain happened to have the smallest competition with it, that the whole American people were forbidden the advantage of the direct importation of wine, oil, and fruit from Portugal, but must take them loaded with all the expenses of a voyage 1,000 leagues about, amounting in wartime at least to 30%, merely that a few Portugal merchants in London may gain a commission on those goods passing through their hands. Got a point there. So we're just basically paying the merchants extra because they couldn't get things imported directly. They had to go through London first. Portugal merchants, by the by, that can complain loudly of the smallest hardship laid on their trade by foreigners, and yet even the last year could oppose with all their influence the giving ease of their fellow subjects laboring under so heavy an oppression, that on a slight complaint of a few Virginia merchants, 9 colonies had been restrained from making paper money, become absolutely necessary to their internal commerce from the constant remittance of their gold and silver to Britain. Yeah, don't take our money, dude. That the hatters of England have prevailed and to obtain an act in their own favor, restraining that manufacture in America. So you're not allowed to make hats? Interesting. In order to oblige the Americans to send their beaver to England to be manufactured and purchase back the hats, loaded with charges of a double transportation. Geez, that is expensive. What the flip? Why in the world? Okay, so you're gonna kill beavers, sell the furs to hatters in Britain because you're not allowed to make hats in American colonies. They weren't allowed to make hats. And what happened if they did? Honestly, oh my gosh. So they're paying for they're paying to send their beaver to Britain to be made into hats, to be sent back to America to be sold there. That sounds really dumb. That's I'm at a loss for words here. In the same manner have a few nail makers and still a smaller body of steel makers, perhaps there are not half a dozen of these in England, prevailed totally to forbid, by an act of Parliament, the erecting of slitting mills or steel furnaces in America, that the Americans may be obliged to take all the nails for their buildings and the steel for their tools from these artificers under the same disadvantages. So you're saying that we have all of the natural resources in the American colonies to make these things ourselves, but we're not allowed to because the manufacturers are all in London. We have to send our natural resources over to London to be made into nails and other steel tools to be sent back to the colonies to be used there. That sounds really dumb. That would piss me off too. And I think anybody agrees that that's really dumb. Add to these, the Americans remembered the act authorizing the most cruel insult that people was ever offered by one people to another, that of emptying our goals into their settlements, Scotland too having within these 2 years obtained the privilege it had not before of sending its rogues and villains also to the plantations. Yeah, they used to use the American colonies as a penal colony, so they would send thieves and what they called rogues, highwaymen, people who they caught doing things that they weren't allowed to do, and then they would send them off there, and they're like, gee, thanks for sending the awesome people. Wow. Yeah, that would piss me off too, once again. I get the revolutionary people. I'm like, yeah, you absolutely had a right to be pissed off. I say, reflecting on these things, they said to one another, their newspapers are full of such discourses. These peoples are not content with making a monopoly of us, forbidding us to trade with any other country in Europe, and compelling us to buy everything of them, though in many articles we could furnish ourselves 10, 20, and even 50% cheaper elsewhere. But now they have as good as declared they have a right to tax us ad libitum, internally and externally, and that our constitutions and liberties shall be taken away if we do not submit to that claim. I'm curious as to what ad libitum means. Libitum? Ad libitum? Ad libitum. It means in accordance with one's wishes. Okay, I know a lot of people hearing would probably already have known that, but sorry, I don't speak Latin. But it is very interesting. I should probably learn if I'm going to be reading these. They are not content with the high prices at which they sell us their goods, but have now begun to enhance those prices by new duties, and by the extensive apparatus of a new set of officers, appear to intend an augmentation and multiplication of those burdens that shall still be more grievous to us. Our people have been foolishly fond of their superfluous modes and manufactures to the impoverishing our country, carrying off all our cash and loading us with debt. They will not suffer us to restrain the luxury of our inhabitants as they do that of their own by laws. They can make laws to discourage or prohibit the importation of French superfluities, but though those of England are as ruinous to us as the French ones are to them, if we make a law of that kind, they immediately repeal it. Thus they get all our money from us by trade, and every profit we can anywhere make by our fisheries, our produce, and our commerce center finally with them. But this does not satisfy. It is time, then, to take care of ourselves by the best means in our power. Let us unite in solemn resolutions and engagements with and to each other, that we will give these new officers as little trouble as possible by not consuming the British manufactures on which they are to levy the duties. Yeah. Let us agree to consume no more of their expensive gewgaws. Let us live frugally, and let us industriously manufacture that which we can for ourselves. Thus we shall be able honorably to discharge the debts we already owe them, and after that we may be able to keep some money in our country, not only for the uses of our internal commerce, but for the service of our gracious sovereign, whenever he shall have occasion for it, and think proper to require it of us in the old constitutional manner. For notwithstanding the reproaches thrown out against us in their public papers and pamphlets, notwithstanding we have been reviled in their senate as rebels and traitors, we are truly a loyal people. I would actually have to agree with that, considering that all of this happened where they're very, very unhappy, and all they're doing is boycotting certain products. And the actual Revolutionary War didn't start for another 8 years. You know, I feel like they are a loyal people. They tried very hard to be loyal, but geez, they were being treated very badly. So I get it. I get it. Yeah. Scotland has had its rebellions, and England its plots against the present royal family, but America is untainted with those crimes. Well, they won't be forever. It's okay. There is in it scarce a man, there is not a single native of our country who is not firmly attached to his king by principle and by affection. I think that's putting it too strongly. I don't think that anybody, any country in the world can say that everybody loves the king. I'm willing to bet there's some people who are not loyal to the king. I'm just throwing that out there. Anyway, but a new kind of loyalty seems to be required of us. A loyalty, and I think this means Parliament, a loyalty to Parliament, a loyalty that is extended, it is said, to a surrender of all our properties whenever I have no idea what they're trying to say here, H of C, whenever a H of C. If you know, please put it in the comments, because I have no idea what that's supposed to say, okay? In which there is not a single member of our choosing shall think fit to grant them away without our consent, and to a patient suffering the loss of our privileges as Englishmen, if we cannot submit to make such surrender. We are separated too far from Britain by the ocean, but we were united to it by respect and love. so that we could at any time freely have spent our lives and little fortunes in its cause. But this unhappy new system of politics tends to dissolve those bands of union and to sever us forever. Uh-huh. Okay. Okay. These are the wild ravings of the at present half-distracted Americans. To be sure, no reasonable man in England can approve of such sentiments. And as I said before, I do not pretend to support or justify them, but I sincerely wish, for the sake of the manufactures and commerce of Great Britain, and for the sake of the strength which a firm union with our growing colonies would give us, that these peoples had never been thus needlessly driven out of their senses. I am yours, etc., F and S. I find that interesting that even though everything that this person wrote completely makes sense, it makes logical sense, and then at the end he calls them the wild ravings of half-distracted Americans. So now I'm not sure which side he's on. If I'm assuming it's a he because of the time. It is a gender assumption on my part, and I will continue to assume that because this time was very patriarchal. So I think that's a fair assumption. So my question is this correspondent really on the side of the Americans, or is he not? Or is it just something that he wrote in order to get it published so that, he could present these as someone else's opinion and be like, no, I think completely differently. I am completely on the side of the British people, the British Parliament. I don't think the British people had much to say about this. I think that a lot of their arguments are very reasonable, that a lot of the ways they were treated at the time made, they weren't acceptable, and I think boycotting products that were very highly taxed makes sense. I mean, honestly, if you could make them yourself cheaper, why wouldn't you? And then having somebody say you're not allowed to, you're like, excuse me? What in the world are you saying? I'm not allowed to make it in the American colonies at all? Because that doesn't make any sense. If you say I have to have some sort of license or prove that I'm able to make it, if I'm just making it for myself and I'm not selling them, who cares? I would do it. There's no reason you should need a permit to make yourself a hat. You see what I mean? So if I were selling hats, then maybe you would need a permit. But, they wouldn't even allow people to make their own, and I just don't see that as making any sense at all. That makes no sense to me at all. It's interesting that they were gatekeeping so many of these manufacturing fields, glass making and things like that. That was a serious gatekeeping move. What if they had worked in glass keeping in Britain before they moved there? Glass making. Honestly, why wouldn't they be able to continue to do it if they knew how? Because they weren't allowed. Anyway, sorry. I just think that's very interesting, and it's very interesting to see this from their perspective and how extremely clear it was at the time. And how very unclear it became later. Is looking back, I think that most of us don't really understand what caused the Revolutionary War. But reading this, it's I get it. Oh yeah. I would react that way too. I'm just saying. The things that they were upset about and things that they weren't. Anyway, thank you for joining me for another time capsule, and please come back again for our next one. See you soon.